Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 358, and it's dated October 13th, 1978. It accompanies the tape that I have dated for the week before, and it's a continuation of the material. For those of you who subscribe regularly, this tape will just be mailed out to you together for the 2 weeks tapes together at one time. And those that subscribe later or order back issues can order them by the numbers. But I may as well mail these to you now because the material is a continuous series from what I did the week before. One reason I'm sending this material off at the same time is that I am going down to Los Angeles next week. I'll be away. It's the Jewish New Year's, and I'm going down to be with my family. My father's a rabbi, and I go down there if I can for the Jewish New Year's. And it's Yom Kippur. That's a Jewish holiday where they have a large memorial service, and the names of the people who passed away in the past year or members of families that have passed away are named. And there's a long list of well-known Jews who have passed away in the past year, who are named in the memorial service. And it's kind of a coincidence here that this particular tape I'm sending you coincides this litany of deaths of witnesses to the John Kennedy assassination. But I'm just wondering if there isn't something in my background where I began to become aware of large numbers of people dying in 1 year, or hearing that list every year, because the way I did my research was begin to add up how many people related to a different topic died, or how many rock musicians died, how many people, for example, in the first tape this week or last week in the Vatican. Other people are adding it up. And I think if this adding procedure had been done, say, in Nazi Germany, when people began to disappear from the towns and villages, assuming people cared enough to keep a record, they would have come up with some interesting figures before they got to the 6 millionth person, if they had just added up the missing and the people taken away and never seen again. And I think the adding of those people, it was always stayed in my mind that if people had begun to add up the missing people earlier, there's no way that they could have gotten to the 6 million figure, the pile of bones that they ended up with. And I think the same thing can be applied to the witnesses to the John Kennedy assassination, the direct witnesses, the fringe witnesses, the family members. We have to examine how much did these people know, if they were thrown out of cars, if their throats were cut, if they fell out of buildings, if their cars were blown up, the circumstances under which each of these people died. I haven't gone into detail. A lot of them you can get from the 4 volumes of books from Penn Jones' book, Forgive My Grief. And he has a newsletter that goes out every month called The Continuing Inquiry. And Penn has been the major source for many of the deaths that many of us around the country wouldn't pick up if it weren't for Penn Jones. That has been his real specialty, is keeping track of these deaths. We owe him a debt for that. And I think it's important to keep these lists. I have a list of witnesses to the Manson family that were murdered, to the Robert Kennedy assassination, to the Martin Luther King assassination. Then you can begin to add countries, how many people in Lebanon are dying, in Pakistan, in Kenya, in Paraguay, in Argentina, how many are missing, in Chile, how many are taken off and never come back, how many people are on a genocide plan, articles on genocide, articles on the takeover of the country. It begins to start with, say, one person, in my particular case studying John Kennedy's assassination, and then getting information about RAND studies of killing 63 million Americans to release our energy crisis, so there'll be enough of our natural resources for the remaining population. And then going to the chemicals of IG Farben that were made, the slave labor they used, and the chemicals they used over at Auschwitz, and realizing that IG Farben is in the United States and all over the world, and because they were never punished before, they have the capability of repeating what they did in Germany and making the dyes and the chemicals to erase large numbers of people. So I imagine the accumulation of deaths, of bodies piled up, is in direct proportion to the crises which occur, the depressions, and the necessity to hold on to corporate holdings without building houses and schools and health care for the mass population and feeding the population. And it's very easy when you have a lot of things to say, well, there's too many of them, they'll take it from me. There's too many Mexicans. CIA says get rid of 40 to 60 million. That's one of their plans. Then dig up all the oil resources you have. It's nice to sit back and figure, well, the world's too populated, so I have it now, and there's too many of them, and I don't know them anyway. They're too far away, so forget the whole thing. But what you don't realize is large cities in the United States and all over the world that may contain you and members of your family are going to be wiped out through chemicals and gases. I absolutely believe that if we don't stop it. And I got into those matters when I was studying the Kennedy assassination. So as I read off these deaths of these various people from the tape last week and a continuation of that, I take it very seriously. I think about the holidays and the memorial services. I think about plans that this government has for those kinds of contingencies of too many people on the earth. And therefore, each name that I'm giving here as a possible witness to the assassination of John Kennedy, or Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement, somebody who knew Jack Ruby, was at the site of the assassination, a newspaper person who knew too much, a government employee, an agent that was involved that had to be killed because the investigations were coming, the agents that were hired to do some of the killing. As each one of these people are knocked off, the sum total keeps getting more gross, and then you realize just how strong the media is to cover up, like Mr. Karamisin's death. Very few people saw it last week. 3 direct witnesses to the House Select Committee died last week. Their names aren't mentioned. Nothing is said. It's a serious thing, so that each individual named on these lists is an important person and helps create the sum total of what those in power intend to do and how they get away with it. And a lot of these deaths are very public, like mafia deaths, as a warning to other people. You know, the shootings in the mouth and being found dead, these hunting incidences. William Sullivan, highest man in counterintelligence in the FBI, Division 5 of the FBI, shot, and the person who shot him isn't reprimanded. The son of a policeman shoots one of the highest men in the FBI and gets off with losing his hunting license and a little fee. So I'll continue with the names of the people that died, but the importance of them, I can't emphasize enough. It goes back again, that book by Seymour Melman, how 400 deaths in Germany, I don't know how they came to that figure, but 400 had to be killed before Adolf Hitler was elected in 1933 to make Hitler's regime possible. And I'm sure that of those, many important people were killed, and then the people next to them had to be murdered. Either they were used to set the time or the place or to set them up, and they had to be murdered. And so death is a very much part of keeping the conspiracy silent, and this is why I put death on the priority list of things to look into before you get into even the evidence of the assassination of John Kennedy or Martin Luther King. Well, Ed Kendricks is one of the witnesses that died. I'll get back to that list. Donald Kaler, he was a former chemist for the Warren Commission. You wonder if he were alive, if his findings would be different than those chemists and ballistics experts they pulled in 1978. Jim Keogh, he was in Jack Ruby's apartment the night Ruby was arrested. He died of a karate chop to his neck, similar to David Ferry, who also died from that kind of a chop. Of course, all 3 men that were in Jack Ruby's apartment died shortly thereafter, one in a police department in Long Beach. Karen Capsonet knew of an early link of a conspiracy. She's alleged to have known links of Sam Giancana to the CIA assassination teams. She comes from Chicago, and 2 days before John Kennedy was to be killed, she heard a conversation about that. I believe her father's a writer. I met a man in Hollywood when I was down there working with Terry Moore on a book. I think I mentioned him way back on other tapes, who was very knowledgeable about the murder of Karen, but he said quite clearly, I'm not going to talk because my uncle was Sam Giancana, and Giancana had just been murdered the year before. And he said, I was brought up in Brooklyn. He mentioned the section, and he says, we don't talk about those kind of things. I'm not going to talk about it, but she was murdered, and he knows who did it. And the gentleman who was talking happens to be a very well-known producer in Hollywood now of films and TV series. You'd all know the series if I mentioned the names. I think you'll have to excuse my voice and stuffy nose. I think I'm coming down with a cold, and of course the tape picks it up faster than I can really hear it myself, but I feel it. So I'm sure that you're getting those sounds of a cold coming on. David Lane worked with Jack Ruby, worked with the Castro Gambling Syndicate in Havana. He died in 1964. Eugene Locke, the well-known attorney, well-known to John Connally. Also, Marguerite Oswald knew John Locke, the attorney. He resigned as deputy ambassador to Vietnam. He was John Connally's first campaign manager, and he was the attorney for Officer J.D. Tippett's widow, the man that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly shot. Before the assassination, he was the attorney for Mrs. Tippett, and he was going to run for governor of Texas. He died in 1972. Alfred McLean, Ruby's associate, another one of the pre-Castro gambling syndicate. He was in the clubs with Frank Sturgis and Santos Trafficante, and would have some tales to tell about these events that have been discussed on radio at the House Select Committee. But as you can see, as I run down the list, that many of the witnesses who could be called are dead now. Marilyn Magyar, an employee of Jack Ruby, she was at the Carousel Club. She was going to write a book on the assassinations, died in 1966. Ronaldo Masferher, I mentioned his companion that was killed. They were killed, automobile blown up. CIA agent, worked with the anti-Castro Cubans, worked with all the exiles involved in the JFK assassination. He was at the no-name Key base. He was in the CIA and associated with Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt. Mary Pinochet Meyer, a close friend of John Kennedy's, close links to the CIA and counterintelligence, aligned with James Eagleton, and was closely, had direct personal contacts with John Kennedy, could possibly either get information from him or be linked to him as another one of his females after he was killed. But James Eagleton is alive. He's one of those witnesses that should be called and asked some questions, but she died in 1964. Dr. De Lesseps Morrison, a New Orleans mayor, ambassador to the original, the Organization of American States, links to Guy Bannister, who died, who also had close associations with Robert Mayu, the FBI, and the CIA in New Orleans. Betty Mooney McDonald is one of the better-known early deaths in 1964, the stripper for Jack Ruby, who provided an alibi for a man that she was with who had been accused or suggested of killing Officer J.D. Tippett. Frank Martin, a police officer, he told the Warren Commission, "I know a great deal." He lived until 1966. Audie Murphy, the famous war pilot, war hero, had high links to the Howard Hughes organization and to Jimmy Hoffa. He was trying to get Hoffa out of jail. Terry Moore, the actress, knew Audie very well and thought that he was murdered. He had been visiting La Costa, where Jim Braden is a charter member. Jim Braden is the gentleman that was recognized by police, I won't say arrested, at the time of the assassination. He was in the Dow Tex building. We'll do more about Jim Braden. Jim Brading, Eugene Brading is his name. Active with Mo Dalitz and the La Costa organization in California. And Audie Murphy was working with Hoffa and these people at the time that he died. Joseph Miltier, he was mentioned at the House Select Committee hearings. He's the gentleman who had the tapes that said that John Kennedy was going to be killed. There'd be a high-powered rifle with a scope attached. It was supposed to take place in Miami, and they were going to set up a patsy. He's a member of the right-wing extremist group, and as I mentioned on the preceding tape about the Minutemen executing John Kennedy, this could be one of the links of the Minutemen to the Miami plans. And then Miltier was seen, a face that looked exactly like Miltier was in Dealey Plaza, and the House Select Committee chose to excuse that it wasn't Miltier because this man is shorter than Joseph Miltier. They didn't go into the features with their anthropologists, or they didn't get out many pictures of Miltier or the statistics on his size, but when it served their interest to say that this man was too short to be Miltier, then they ruled out that it was him. When they wanted Lee Harvey Oswald to be short or tall, or any of us, they said we could all vary 1 to 2 inches every day. Our heights just seem to go up and down, which is interesting. And they also said cameras on dollies can change heights. So I'm sure they could have arranged Mr. Miltier to be 6'1" if they wanted it to be some particular person, a Cuban or a friend of Fidel Castro's. If he were down there on his knees, they could make him 6'1" by arranging the camera or the dolly, or the anthropologist would come in. But in this particular case, Miltier couldn't possibly in Dealey Plaza, according to this House Select Committee of 1978. as against the Warren Commission that never even entertained the idea of going into Eugene Brading or Joseph Miltier, even though they had the tapes of the assassination plans 3 weeks earlier in Miami. They still chose to make Lee Harvey Oswald the lone assassin in 1964, and they'll do it again in 1978. Ronald Curtis McLean lived at Beckley Street, where Lee Harvey Oswald lived. He had knowledge of Lee Harvey Oswald. He was murdered and left in an abandoned mine shaft. I got this information from a man who's in prison right now at Folsom Prison who knew Ronald Curtis McLean and came to me with information on the assassination. George McGann died in 1959. He knew Jack Ruby in gambling interests, and he knew H.L. Hunt and his relationships to Ruby. He was a friend of Billy Saul Estes, and he knew Richard Nixon, and this man was gunned down in Lubbock, Texas. Lewis Nichols died in 1977, just a year ago when these commission hearings were getting formed. He worked under J. Edgar Hoover. He was in the Bureau during the JFK assassination. He died of a heart attack. I grant you that some of these people like Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover and Lewis Nichols were on in years, but during their entire lifetime they were never pressed for the information that was available, and even if they had lingering deaths or heart attacks, I mention them because the circumstances of where they died, who they died with, or their wills seemed that there was some hanky-panky in their deaths, and that's why I bring them in. Charles Nicoletti, from the organized crime, Chicago area, worked with Sam Giancana, Santos Traficanta, worked with the anti-Castro Cubans and the assassination teams that Robert Mayo set up. He's a name that is not brought in when the news media or the House Select Committee talk about Sam Giancana or John Rosselli. They don't bring in that Charles Nicoletti died just at the same time as did Carlos Perios Sequeiros, George de Mohrenschildt, William Sullivan. There was a nest of deaths all taking place at one time, and they zoom in on Rosselli and Giancana and ignore the other deaths of people that all knew each other and were all related to each other. Robert Novera, he made an abortive attempt on Castro's life. He worked with the CIA and FBI, the anti-Castro Cubans. He died in 1964. Orville Nix, the gentleman that took the pictures on the grassy knoll at the time that he died in 1972, I believe it was in Penn's book, that he said that he may have shown pictures of the firing over there on the grassy knoll of a person in the bushes, and when the House Select Committee did their camera work and tried to see if there were figures in the leaves, there was one figure that they discounted by the curb, but they did in fact see a man with his hands and face exactly where the discussion was among the critics that this person would be. Of course, the media, this is where Nina Totenberg and Joe Volch come in, and the newspapers come in and say, but they're not sure he was holding a rifle, but there was, in fact, a man. So what would be a rifle might be a stick, and that sort of swept under the rug. That's one of those pieces of information that's choking them that they have to put under the rug. Karen Bennett Carlin, Ruby employee known as Little Lynn. She was the last person that had been with Jack Ruby. She died in 1964. I have Alexander Onassis down here, a United States pilot from Ohio, was put in jail and charged for sabotaging his airplane. Alexander Onassis and his father and Marie Callas and the entire Onassis group, I am very positive, know too much about the John Kennedy assassination. And of course the reason that Jacqueline Onassis stays alive, and we'll go into her at length at another time, is I'm not certain that she isn't a big wheeler or dealer. She and her sister, the Princess Bradswell, are very important to world politics, and that's why Jackie Onassis stays alive. She's as important as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor with their Nazi connections, wanted at every social party. She is the cover for the beautiful people, and to set the pace, she's the last person you suspect of wanting John Kennedy killed until you read what happened to her, and you've read some of it and some of the motives, and she has a motive as good as any single wife I know who's ever killed her husband, and she has the means, and the people around her have all died, and she's gotten her payoff. I mean, just a lump sum from Onassis was $26 million, but that contract was written before they ever set up that marriage. Lee Harvey Oswald died, or his double died. I put that with a question mark. One of them died, and one of them was buried, and one of them was ordered to be cremated. And if there in fact were two, one is alive. And I have mentioned before, and we'll go in at length about doubles at another time, I believe from information I got that one was flown to Baton Rouge and down to Brazil, disguised under the cloak of the Mormon Church as a missionary, and is still alive today, unless they killed him when he got down there. But that's another subject. But one of those Oswalds is dead, in fact dead. Robert Lee Perrin was the husband of Nancy Ling Perrin, the gentleman that fled Dallas, Texas in a hurry because of the links of Jack Ruby to the military and DeVito Genovese of organized crime. You notice how Santos Trafficante came on the radio and at the House Select Committee talking about assassination teams, but we didn't see Carlos Marcello, and we didn't hear the name Vito Genovese except once. George Piazza, an assistant to District Attorney Jim Garrison, he was on the way to interview a witness in 1967. He died. Lieutenant William Pitzer took pictures of the JFK autopsy. He was threatened, don't tell what you know. He died shortly after John Kennedy in 1966. He was in the Navy 28 years. He retired a month later, and after his 28 years, and he was found with a bullet in his head. Gary Powers was one of the primary witnesses that died in August of 77. He said that Lee Harvey Oswald had a role in downing the U-2 flight. Gary Powers would have to have worked under the Vice Admiral Rufus Taylor, that I talked about, just when the committee started getting their money and funding. This great pilot flyer was killed over Los Angeles in a weather reconnaissance plane. Freddie Prinze is mentioned in George O'Toole's new book. He had the Abraham Zapruder films. He was working on the John Kennedy case. Freddie Prinze was with Dr. Kroger, a hypnotist from the Los Angeles Police Department, who worked in the Chowchilla case. He was suicidal. He was on Quaaludes. He was on the same drugs that were given Donald DeFreeze that changed his personality in Vacaville. And when he went home, the doctor handed him a weapon, and Freddie Prinze went home and put the weapon to his head and killed himself. Now that is unheard of. I know many people have been confined to hospitals. I've had direct experience myself with family and friends and studying this research. When a person is suicidal, you have the right to take them even if they object against their wishes. If they're a danger to themselves as well as to any other person, you can take them to a hospital and have them confined. The psychiatrist can do it. The sheriff will come and put handcuffs. If there's any indication they're a danger to themselves, they can be put in for 48 hours, I believe it is, or 72 hours. Freddie Prinze was working on the John Kennedy case. He was with a man who works with the police departments, has worked in other conspiracy cases. Famous people, actors, I'm sure there's not too many of them into the Kennedy case, but they would lend a lot of respect or money or energy if they were able to talk about the conspiracy. But Freddie Prinze died in 1977. Paul Rygotorodsky was a man that worked in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, worked with the Anti-Communist League, the Tolstoy Foundation, the Solidarists, the CIA, the conduit of the CIA Greek Orthodox Church that took care of Marina Oswald, brought her to this country, also brought the Sirhan family from Palestine when Israel became a country into Pasadena in 1957. Paul Rygotorodsky died in Texas, and he was an associate. He knew very well George de Mohrenschildt. And 1 week after Rygotorodsky died, George de Mohrenschildt, who was teaching at the university in Texas, fled the country. He just took everything, left, went to Europe to Willem Altman's place, and then went to Florida where he, in quote, shot himself in the mouth after massive electronic treatment. He had electroshocks at Parkland Hospital. He had psychiatrists that I'm sure that were telling him, George, you kill yourself and the world will be better off. Why don't you kill yourself? I'm sure that he was programmed. The gun was in the drawer. He knew where to find it, and he blew his brains out. But his flight and his fear, his fear of being killed and being in danger, followed 1 week after the death of Paul Rygotorodsky. And Rygotorodsky's name is in the Torbett document as having a compound down at Tyrol Bay with John Conley, and Albert Osborne was there, various agents from the defense industry agencies, and Osborne was on the bus going to Mexico with Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm repeating some of this occasionally so that I hopefully have a fantasy that it'll finally sink into a lot of people's heads just exactly what is going on and why John Connolly's on the stand. And they don't ask him about Tyrol Bay or the School for Assassins in Oaxaca, Mexico, or the organization he belongs to, and if he has links to Permindex, or the Defense Industry Security Command, and then investments and interest in the Friends of Middle East to cook up a few holy wars over there when the Vietnam War scales down and we have control of their narcotics traffic and weapons industry and so forth. Then we get over to the Middle East to pick up a little more action. When I rattled off several weeks ago the problems I had with the committee, and I'll get more specific with you, having the right person on the stand and asking the wrong questions, a perfect example is having John Connolly on the stand and not asking him if he ever knew of Paul Rygotorodsky. John Connolly wants to run for president of the United States in 1980, and I suggest that you go to the library and start collecting a lot of information and get out a book on John Connolly, information like I did with the Evel Younger tapes. And all of you, when I say get a book, write your own mimeograph sheets, make 10, 20, 30 copies, and send them to various members of Congress, and try to stop the fantasies of John Connolly being president, or he will be president, just as Gerald Ford on the Warren Commission was president of the United States. Robert Robertson was the owner of an airplane, along with Hobart Higgins, who died. He knew Jack Ruby. Higgins had died strangely, and Robertson said all of the troubles go back to the John Kennedy assassination. He had told people he would not live a week, and he was dead the next morning. Jack Eugene Ramsey died. He was alleged to have assisted in the escape of one of the assassins, and he may have been involved in the manhole theory. Harold Russell was an eyewitness to the Tippit murder. He was beaten by the police wielding a revolver. He died in 1965. Earlene Roberts, I mentioned before, ran the rooming house where the Harvey Oswald stayed on Beckley Street, and her sister Bertha Cheek was in contact with Jack Ruby, offering him a large sum of money just prior to the assassination. George Rockwell, another well-known American Nazi Party official, died in 1967. His name was in Lee Harvey Oswald's notebook, the name and address. John Rosselli of organized crime, you've heard that name, it was brought up at the House Select Committee. John Rosselli and Sam Giancana's names will be legend, and I just doubt if these other names are as famous. Well, Dorothy Kilgallen, you know. Then there's Jack Ruby, who died he was sick in the Dallas jail. He died at Parkland Hospital. As I told you, there was a Warren Commission memo that while they were writing the Warren report about him, they had to be cautious because, in quotes, he's still dickering for his fate. And that, again, reminds me of the hearings where Richard Helms is saying that the CIA has a memo on Yuri Noshenko on whether or not to send him to the loony bin or liquidate him. Perry Raymond Russo, he testified for Jim Garrison in the trial against Clay Shaw. He had a cerebral hemorrhage similar to David Ferry and others. Clay Shaw died in 1974. Jim Garrison was saying from 1967 until Shaw's death that he was in the Central Intelligence Agency, but only after Watergate did the links come out of Shaw to Howard Hunt and the Watergate members, and he died quickly, and there was no autopsy, quick embalming, and he was buried. Mrs. Earl Smith, her husband was a former U.S. ambassador. She was a confidant of Helen Kilgallen's, and she died the day after Dorothy Kilgallen died. And Dorothy had told friends that she was going to break the story of Kennedy's death. Dr. Mary Sherman was associate of David Ferry. She was a key witness in the New Orleans trial for Jim Garrison, shot to death in New Orleans, and the body was burned. Carlos Prios Sequeiros, an important witness in 77, one of those 1977 witnesses, the former president of Cuba, named in the Torbett document as being a big wheel of blending the gambling syndicate and the Cubans with the white Russian community. He died in Florida, May the 5th, 1977, one time a business associate of Jack Ruby's. John Stiles died in a car crash just at the time that Gerald Ford's hearings were coming up to be President of the United States. This was April 16, 1976. He wrote the book for Gerald Ford, The Portrait of the Assassin, which is a book made up from CIA documents and FBI documents, creating a fictitious person of Lee Harvey Oswald, and hoping that that version of history would last through the centuries. There are a few more deaths to run down, and I didn't realize they'd take this long, and I hope they're of interest to you. I'll put them on the other side of this tape and then go into some destruction of evidence that was important. And then we'll continue on in the weeks with Marina Oswald and other information on the House Select Committee. Another Sullivan that's important besides William Sullivan is a woman, the wife of Mr. Jack Sullivan, who was killed, and a friend of hers is vowing to open this story, and I'll do an entire tape on this story maybe in the near future, but it involves Sedona, Arizona, a place that she says does mind control, and this woman who brought me the information said that Jack Sullivan had taken a yellow pill and then began the altering of his personality in the contacts of military people, and that he was involved somehow in the John Kennedy assassination. This is Mae Brussell, and this is tape 358, and the date here is October the 13th, 1978. The importance of Mrs. Jack Sullivan dying in a strange way after being able to get some information from her husband, who is programmed, similar to Candy Jones being programmed by the CIA, comes or leads the path to Sedona, Arizona, where the allegations are made that it's in this town that the brainwashing is done, or one of the many places for the Central Intelligence Agency, in the town of Sedona, Arizona. I know the area well because my boys went to school there at Verde Valley, and when we went to visit them at the school, Marina Oswald was in Sedona, Arizona. And if I were as smart then as I am now, I would have made a point to try and see her, and if she was sequestered away, and knock on the door of the apartment where she was staying and try to find out what was going on. But I was pretty dumb in those days and was totally unaware of taking people off and doing memory jobs on them or erasing their memory. There is a lot of research being done into the murder of Mrs. Jack Sullivan, and I'll get back to that with you at another time. In alphabetical order, I mentioned Vice Admiral Rufus Taylor being murdered, and under that is Donald Edward Tuback. He was in San Diego, questioned by the FBI the day that Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. David Ferry was questioned by Jim Garrison in New Orleans the day after John Kennedy was assassinated. Mr. Tuback was engaged to be married the day that John F. Kennedy was shot, and after that, in 1976, he was stabbed 12 times. His ex-wife was from a South American company, worked with a travel agency based in San Diego, and he seemed to have had some links to the Jack Ruby connection of killing Lee Harvey Oswald. And of course, Officer J.D. Tippit was shot in the Oak Cliff section of Texas and Dallas the day of the assassination, and that sacrifice of Tippit was the excuse to arrest Lee Harvey Oswald, who was probably told to go to the theater. Mr. Marchetti says that that's a common CIA place for people to meet in theaters and exchange messages. It's dark, and he probably had instructions to go to this particular theater. Clyde Tolson, companion of J. Edgar Hoover, his housemate, he wasn't at home the night J. Edgar Hoover was killed, even though J. Edgar Hoover was always in the company of somebody. Tolson died in 1975. Hoover died in 72. Carol Tyler died in 1965. She was the secretary to Bobby Baker and long associate of Lyndon Johnson, protege of Lyndon Johnson's, or vice versa. I heard Baker on television making it out that Johnson leaned on him. They had a very cozy relationship in influencing Congress and wheeling and dealing in Washington, D.C. Carol Tyler died in a plane crash in 1965, and then her roommate, who worked for Senator Smathers in Florida, the roommate's name is Mary Jo Kopechny, died in an automobile accident and was drowned in 1972 in Chappaquiddick. She switched from Senator Smathers' offices to Robert Kennedy's, and then after he died, she was with Ted Kennedy, and then Ted Kennedy's car was at Chappaquiddick, and Mary Jo Kopechne was found dead in that car. Gary Underhill, a CIA contact agent, high contacts in the Pentagon, knew who killed John Kennedy. He had said that he was sure they would get him. He died of gunshot wounds shortly after he said that. That was one of those early deaths in 1964. The series that was written up, the primary deaths in 1964. Gary Underhill was very important. Marilyn Delilah Whaley, W-A-L-L-E, a stripper, Jack Ruby's, died. And as I mentioned on the other tape, Buddy Walters, I'm down to W, the Dallas police officer who found the .45 caliber slug in the grass where John Kennedy was killed, died of gunshot wounds in the line of duty. Dr. William Wolfe, next-door neighbor of George de Mohrenschildt, died in 1963, and General Walker testified that he was a psychiatrist and suggested he used some kind of mind control. Now, he may have been the man who worked with de Mohrenschildt and Lee Harvey Oswald, the control of Lee and Marina, the mental part of it, the drug part of it, like Dr. Kroger with Freddie Prinze. It was General Walker who called attention to the fact that Dr. Wolfe knew something and was right next door to George de Mohrenschildt, and that he burned strangely in the first floor apartment where he could have gotten out. William Whaley, the cab driver that took either Lee Harvey Oswald or Oswald's double to the Oak Cliff section, died of a car crash, similar to Karen Silkwood's car crash when she had information on atomic poisoning and uranium leakage and so forth in Oklahoma. Hugh Ward died in 1964. Another important witness, associate of Guy Bannister, who worked with the FBI and the CIA, associate of Dr. de Lesseps and Morrison in the New Orleans area. He died in a plane crash in 1964. James Worrell died in 1966. He's the gentleman who saw Oswald or the Oswald double. If one was leaving the front of the building, then this was the double. And Worrell is the man that was behind the Texas School Book Depository who saw this 23-year-old man leaving, and he died in a motorcycle accident. General Clyde Watts died in 1975. He was General Walker's attorney when Howard Duff made statements and wanted to tell the Secret Service that he had seen Jack Ruby at the home of General Walker. He was threatened and fled and went to Oklahoma and stayed with Clyde Watts, who allegedly got him a job. And he called his wife and said, call off the Secret Service of the investigators or I'll be killed. Coincidentally, or whatever you call it, Watts has never been asked these questions about Duff before the Warren Commission. And, of course, Watts died in 75, so he couldn't be called before the House Select Committee. But Howard Duff was never found, and neither was the Secret Service called to present this information. Abraham Zapruder took films in front of the Texas School Book Depository that have gone on to become the most famous home movies in the world. He worked at the Dow Tex building. He was a friend of Lyndon Johnson's. He was a member of the White Russian community. I believe he died of cancer. I always suspected that this story that he went home and took his daughter or secretary and just happened to take pictures that day is open to question. I really believe, just as every conspiracy has its author in residence ready to write the official account, that it's very possible with the links that Abraham Zapruder had, that he was taking these movies, not that they'd be used by anything in the world like the Warren Commission. There would be a Texas court of inquiry that would go into the case. The FBI had solved it within 48 hours. Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin. District Attorney Wade had solved the case. For all purposes, the Dallas police and the FBI had solved it, and if there hadn't been a lot of clamor around the world, there'd be no Warren Commission. But by having a man record the killing of John Kennedy, he just simply photographed on one side of the street what took place. A car going down the street, a man is hit, his head's blown off, and he passes. It reminds me of taking pictures, the CIA, of E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis in front of Dr. Lewis Fielding's offices that they're going to burglarize later, or Adolf Hitler taking detailed pictures of Auschwitz, of everything he did, and records of who they did in, and keeping diaries of it, this fanatical insistence on keeping photographic records of the event. And I think that the reason the Warren Commission didn't use any of the other film available across the street. And Richard E. Sprague has gone around the country for years giving lectures on the photographic evidence on the John Kennedy assassination, about 25,000 different slides, scenes from movies and pictures that were not used. And I think the reason they didn't call in any of that information and only used Abraham Zapruder's film of the actual killing of Kennedy was that by standing on the side of the street that he was on, you couldn't get a view of anybody up in the sixth floor window or not being in the sixth floor window. It's possible that another camera across the street might have seen pictures of people in the roof or in the fifth floor window or somewhere else in the Texas School Book Depository, because there were other weapons in the Texas School Book Depository, and also at the Dow Tex building. It was only because the researchers in the United States, many, many researchers, just like myself, made an effort to collect information, develop their curiosity, and pass along to other people, correspond, long-distance telephone calls, get articles out, read each other's material, write books, get to know each other, and form a body of critics that could be available to have this accumulated evidence. And it was through these efforts that these pictures were procured, that more pictures were obtained, information was obtained about assassins or alleged assassins being taken away. They certainly weren't arrested. Their names weren't taken. There were many suspects at Dealey Plaza, and I can run those down for you at another time. But the value of the pictures is important. The fact that they didn't use them is important. But Abraham Zapruder, who was a crony of Lyndon Johnson's and a member of the White Russian community, died of cancer, and it was his pictures that were to be used by the Warren Commission, and those were the main ones they depended upon. Jack Zangetti died. He had knowledge of Jack Ruby's role in the conspiracy. He died early, right after the assassination in December of '63. He was in Oklahoma. He might have known Clyde Watts or Howard Duff there. He knew the days before that John Kennedy was going to be murdered. He was found in a lake 2 weeks later after Kennedy was killed. He had said that the kidnapping of Frank Sinatra's son would take place to take the heat off the John Kennedy assassination, that it would be a fake kidnapping as a diversionary. And since learning about Jack Zangetti's statements on that matter, I've tried to follow other news events that I've mentioned on the tapes that I think were done to divert, such as when Gerald Ford is running for president. There was that tree chopping incident in Korea that served in his favor because 2 American servicemen were cut up by Koreans there, and it carried a lot of news. It gave him a chance to be patriotic. It gave him a chance to say, well, send in troops and we won't allow this. He could be on the brink of war and go back into Southeast Asia. And it made Gerald Ford the statesman and the warrior. And then the night that Jimmy Carter was nominated was the night of the Chowchilla bus kidnapping, and that again took away from Jimmy Carter or free press statements or interviews later. You'd have to buy time between the nomination and the election, but he had all this time because he was a fairly new person. But the Chowchilla kidnapping came just at that time, and he was put off the news for what they called that year the biggest news story in the country. So these diversionary tactics, I suppose I'm just citing 2, and the Sinatra thing would be 3, but maybe we could add up. If we had a computer someday and could feed information of big disasters and political events, and the proportion of weight that goes to those events that are simultaneously with the politics and the election year, and just see how much is diverted from the major candidates who would need the attention at the time. Eugene Zwart is the last death that I have on this list. Secretary of the Air Force, was stationed in San Antonio. He had arranged John Kennedy's trip to San Antonio. He knew of the plot to kill John Kennedy. He had talked about it. And similar to George de Mohrenschildt and Carlos Prios Sequeiros, in the fashion of organized crime or whatever, when you talk, you get shot in the mouth, and Eugene Zwart was shot in the mouth. There were other witnesses, such as Lauren Hall, who went to Washington to give information on the assassination, who said there were threats on his life after talking to the committee members, and Reverend Broshears, a roommate of David Ferry, who got calls, don't talk or cooperate with the House Select Committee. This was in 1977, or you'll be killed. Wilma Tice, who saw Jack Ruby at Parkland Hospital, and Seth Cantor, the writer, confirmed it, was getting threatening calls. It would pay to keep your mouth shut. And Aquila Clemens, a witness to the killing of Officer J.D. Tippett, said it would be best if you don't say anything or you might get hurt. There are incidences in the 26 volumes that I have in my files of many threats to kill people, but that summarizes up to this day the witnesses, major witnesses that are dead, that would have provided important information, and I think they should be all put in a book someday, in one book, and relate the story of the Kennedy killing through the eyes of the people that were killed. Those of you that don't have that position paper, I call it just the position paper that I wrote in September 17th, 1976, on how to set up a committee to investigate the assassinations, you can send me $2. That's what it costs to copy the paper and the postage. The postage is high these days, and there's 13 pages plus the postage. And I'll send it to you, because in analyzing the House Select Committee, I'll take certain points from that paper and refer to them and then get back to the House Select Committee. But it isn't absolutely necessary that you have it to understand the analysis, because as I take the points, they are parts of that paper that I did write in 1976. It was a personal item I wrote to send to members of Congress investigating the assassinations and various people that were interested in what I considered the basis for a good investigation. Now, first on that list in solving any homicide, I believed and still believe today, is are the primary witnesses killed? Who killed them? Because as you begin to examine evidence, the evidence isn't as important as the witness is killed, for the reason that only certain evidence that is presented and not the whole story. Had other people lived, we may have more evidence, and being as that there's so many deaths surrounding these cases, we're limited to what's available. But the second most important thing in investigating assassinations is the material evidence. Now, that is what makes any homicide fairly easy to solve or difficult to solve. If you have the gun or the clothing, and you can test the bullet direction, how far the bullet came from the person who was killed, what direction it came from, was it entry or exit, and analyze the types of bullets through these pieces of evidence. The pieces of evidence can be the human body, or information on the scene, or letters or documents. The clues to the puzzle are the pieces of the physical evidence, not the opinion of a witness, what they thought they saw and heard, but the actual physical material that is picked up by the police or Secret Service and FBI and law enforcement. The pieces of evidence are the objects, not what they talk about or think they saw or heard. And on the paper I said that my second point after the deaths was investigating pieces of material that have been destroyed, that have been altered in some way, that are missing. We don't know for sure they're destroyed, but they could be in another file. They are delayed. In other words, an example of delayed evidence is the Rolleiflex camera that Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to have used to take the pictures of himself in the backyard at Neely Street, but it wasn't among his possessions at Mrs. Payne's home or at Beckley Street. In fact, it wasn't located for 2 months to be tested, and then it was at his brother's house all along, and they came up with a camera that should have been tested immediately, because later new negatives could be shot with that camera, and then it could be positively identified with that camera. The investigation I wrote, this is in 76, into who killed our leaders can never be solved or explained unless a committee spends a day or two in full committee listening to what physical evidence was destroyed in the hands of the FBI, the Dallas Police, the Secret Service, the doctors attending the autopsy or at Parkland Hospital, or other persons from the Navy, CIA, Defense Intelligence Agencies. They should go down: 1, item destroyed, John Kennedy's brains. 2, date it was destroyed or discovered missing. Okay, Kennedy's brains were put in formaldehyde. They were to be tested a few weeks after the assassination. For all purposes, the only person that I know that brought up the fact that they should be tested for the kind of bullets that went into them to see if they matched the other bullets in the body or car was Dr. Nichols in Kansas City and Cyril Wecht in Pennsylvania. And when Cyril Wecht tried to get to the National Archives, they said the brains were missing. And I think Dr. Nichols had tried to get at them too for a long time. There should be a statement, a clear sheet of the importance of this evidence, what it would provide. In other words, when they get on national television or radio and say, oh, John Kennedy's brains are missing, but 2 bullets did all the damage at Dealey Plaza, went through John Kennedy and John Connolly, it should be pointed out that there are many bullet fragments in the brain, and the brain is gone, and therefore we can't confirm positively that there were not more bullets at Dealey Plaza. The importance of it is that it could show two gunmen, and with extra bullet fragments missing that J. Edgar Hoover tested in 1964, those could be still different. So that, and a shell picked up off the ground at .45, or a shell picked up by Mr. Hicks at Dealey Plaza, there could be 5 different guns. The chances are, if it was a well-planned conspiracy, there'd be some similarity. But being as they had a backup team to do all this picking up, they didn't have to be so careful, and as I say, they never expected the Warren Commission anyway. So there should be a statement of the importance of the evidence. In other words, when Kennedy's brain is missing, there could be more gunmen. Then another point is who saw it last, and that briefly came up at the House Select Committee hearings, and the opinion was that Robert Kennedy had it in some kind of a little box and gave it to Mrs. Lincoln, John Kennedy's secretary, and maybe he just wanted it done in. And evidence that was altered, they should go into who had their hands on it. How was it altered, such as the Abraham Zapruder movie films of John Kennedy being assassinated, were turned around and put in the wrong order. In the Warren Commission hearings, they were published in the wrong order, and much of the evidence that was destroyed was never accounted for. How it was picked up, who saw it last, why they took it, who gave them orders to take it, and this is all important in terms of evidence. So in the hearings of the House Select Committee, it is last month already, it was a week ago, pieces of evidence were missing, and the various witnesses talked about it, and the panel just sat there. That's why I call them the bunch of eunuchs. They can't show any emotion or feeling. They've all been psychologically sterilized so that nothing matters. Richard Helms went on to talk about the CIA file of Lee Harvey Oswald in the John Kennedy case, that Lee Harvey Oswald had a file there and that 39 pages were missing. Nobody said, well, where are the other pages? Let's see the other pages. What do they have about Oswald in the Soviet Union? He simply said 39 pages of the 201 file are missing, and Jan Diaz in Los Angeles, a longtime researcher who worked for the Defense Department, said that Oswald had to work for the CIA to have a 201 file. And Richard Helms said, go on and call Navy intelligence. He didn't want the whole blame, but those are missing. So they talked about the 201 file missing, Kennedy's brains missing. Then they talked about the bullets that were tested by J. Edgar Hoover in 1964 that no longer exist. Now, I think that is enough to just close shop right there. I mentioned it before a couple of weeks ago. I just can't believe that this one gets passed off as a credible story, that anybody can accept the two-bullet theory after hearing that neutron tests were given on fragments that were in John Kennedy's car in 1964 that are different than tests in 1978, and that pieces of bullets from 399 and from John Connolly's wrist were tested in 1964 and are different weights than those tested in the laboratories in 1978. Dr. Vincent Gwynn from NASA had testified that in 1964 Connolly's wrist bullets were tested at Oak Ridge National Laboratories. Two weighed 2.3 milligrams, a third weighed 1.62 milligrams. But in 1978, Dr. Gwynn got a container from the National Archives with assurances this is all the metal they had from Connolly's wrist in their possession, and that they were two different pieces. That this time one weighed 16.4 milligrams and the other weighed 1.3 milligrams. J. Edgar Hoover's tests in 1964 were not conclusive. They were called inconclusive, and I'm sure that the reason he didn't produce them is at that time they would have shown that there were extra people shooting in Dealey Plaza in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald. In 1978, the committee was given bits and pieces of metal brought out by the National Archives. This is from the Washington Post, September 9th, 1978. Not one of them matched the FBI test. The pieces didn't include the earlier Hoover bullets, and they were different weights. They didn't include any of the specific pieces analyzed by the FBI in 1964. I find that pretty shocking. They were also given bullets that were supposed to come out of Army Major General Edwin Walker's home, and they couldn't concur or positively say that Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle shot in the home of General Walker. They could say it was extremely likely that the slug was from a mammal carcano, but they couldn't say positively, and neither could the Warren Commission. And they were forced to admit this time, Robert Blakey, as I say, that the brains were missing. There was also a picture as part of hard evidence. There was a photograph presented by Robert Groden that I talked about on an earlier tape of what was supposed to be a man at the Daltex steps up there at the fire escape at the building directly behind President John Kennedy. This building was in the line of shots. According to Dr. Barger, the area of shooting could come from the Daltex building. He confirmed there was a picture of the man in the window shown by Robert Groden. But when the photographic experts wanted to put down the conspiracy theorists, they showed photographs of Dealey Plaza and Grassy Knoll and said there could be no puff of smoke there. They didn't see it. They showed a picture of what was supposed to be a man on the curb, and it was trees. They showed the picture of another man on the concrete wall that was, in fact, a man, but they couldn't confirm the rifle. But when they ran down all their evidence, I didn't see them rule out a man at the Daltex building. They left that out completely, which is horrendous, because, as I said, Eugene Brading was there, a member of organized crime, a man who had been at the office of H.L. Hunt on Wednesday. Jack Ruby was at the office of H.L. Hunt on Wednesday. So was Connie Trammell from the CIA, the Republic National Bank, with their CIA funding and black money. This man was in the Daltex building, so that when the experts had the evidence that a picture of a man was standing in that stairway at the Daltex, or behind the stairway by the window, that is what I call evidence ignored, because they're not choosing to use that to come to conclusions, and I'm sure their report will not go into the photographic experts analyzing the Daltex building. Correct me if I'm wrong. Let's wait and see what the report comes out, because it would, in fact, show a man, and it might even show Eugene Brading there. We don't know. But as long as they're hiding something, they hide it good. They tease you by saying, here's a photograph of a man on the step, and then they followed up hoping you forgot that by saying, we didn't do tests to see if it was, in fact, the man. John Connolly's clothing and John Kennedy's clothing were brought very dramatically into the House Select Committee hearings the 2 days that it was televised. We had the picture of John Connolly's clothing so that they could discuss the direction, or that the hole went into his coat and exited. It went into his shirt also and exited out his shirt and went into his wrist sleeve and into the thigh. The clothing was used to show the trajectory, the position of the bullets from John Kennedy into John Connolly's body, even though they never analyzed the hole in the thigh, that the position the bullet was in to get into the thigh, or the wrist position, the way it traveled from there. And they also had this hard evidence on the television screen, but didn't say that it had been destroyed by dry cleaning. They never used it as evidence for entry or exit, but simply used it for the holes instead of calling in the people who destroyed it. That's what I tried to say in that position paper, and I didn't make it. I don't know if I made it forceful or clear enough, but where did the chain of command break down? Who had the garment? Who sent it to the dry cleaners? When was it dry cleaned? What would it have told us if it hadn't been dry cleaned? What would we know that would help us stop John Connolly from becoming president in 1980, maybe? Also, the Bullet 399 was referred to during the House Select Committee with no reference that it had blood on it or flesh on it. When they talked about pristine, they meant pristine cling. They didn't only mean particles of the bullet were gone, but there was no sign it had gone through a body when it was found at Parkland Hospital. And the finding of Bullet 399 was never identified as having come from the stretcher of John Connolly. They kept referring to that bullet. And this is important because there was so much talk about Bullet 399 and the direction it made, and yet they couldn't identify where it was found. And if it was found on John Kennedy's stretcher or some other stretcher at Parkland, then that changes the story of the assassins, of the trajectory, and so forth, because if it was planted there, then the other information would probably have to be looked at with closer eyes and more scrutiny. The medical x-rays of John Kennedy were not seen or examined, and when Dr. Morton Halpern wrote about them in 1967, they weren't available. So there is even the question now of whether the x-rays, if they were to be examined by objective persons, would in fact be the same x-rays that were taken when John Kennedy was assassinated. The car interior that I've spoken about many times was removed. We can't tell what bullet fragments were in that car or how many because it was ripped out. The shell of the car remains. It's up in Michigan, and I was told that there would be indications that bullets did indeed go back into that back piece of metal that would be seen from the inside. Notes taken in the Dallas jail, and there were notes taken. There was no stenographer, no tape recorder, but there were notes taken, according to witnesses in the Dallas jail when Lee Harvey Oswald was interviewed, and those notes are not around anymore. They were destroyed. Now, the simple conversation that Sheriff Craig had with Lee Harvey Oswald and James Hosty in Captain Fritz's office, where he said, people will know who I am now because I did get in that car that honked, that belonged to Ruth Payne, opens up a whole new view of the assassination of John Kennedy, the killing of Officer J.D. Tippit, and then Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days later. Just the few words he said that sneaked out that got in the commission hearings were enough to whet the appetite of researchers, and that's why those notes were so important. And of course, the original autopsy notes were burned, and Commander Humes gave the excuse at the House Select Committee that they had blood on them and that he had to destroy them. These things are dictated. A man doesn't put his hand into the bowels or head of a body and get blood all over it and then start writing notes. There were many, many people in the room, and his autopsy reports were dictated and were not covered with blood. If they were, it was the messiest autopsy report he had ever done. But I think he was lying. I think it'd be nice to put his voice under some kind of a stress machine. I don't believe his notes had that much blood on them. The post office application of Lee Harvey Oswald when he lived in Dallas, Texas, was destroyed. Postmaster Humes testified it was destroyed. It's supposed to last 2 years after a person changes their box, or it's a federal crime. Nobody was ever prosecuted, and that would be important because if a gun was ordered in his name and he didn't receive it, who was receiving it and who signed for it and whose name was on that box, in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald's, was a name added so that the name Alec Heidel could receive mail, because that post office application is no longer around, and if the name was there, it could be erased by ink and be photocopied later to show you that only Lee Harvey Oswald got packages there. But in fact, the rifle came to Alec Heidel, and the post office slip was destroyed. We're out of time. I wish I could do more on this destruction of evidence, but we'll have to do some more at another date.